The quiz on Tuesday is just going to cover page 12 in the lab guide where it says brain and associated structures. That's all you need to know for the quiz on Tuesday. You don't have to worry about the cranial nerve part that's at the bottom. That's not going to be on the quiz. So it's literally just that section, brain and associated structures. Now that does include the sheep's brain, and I do have some sheep's brain back there. The good news, I get good news and bad news. The bad news is I can only find 2 non-cut sheep brains. So I got 2 sheep brains that can be cut if you want to cut them. The rest, the good news is I do have enough like cut sheep brain that you can still look at those and still find out. Honestly, the dissection's not all that difficult or exciting. You're basically just taking the scalpel and you're slicing the brain in half, and that's it. So, you're not missing out on something like a really cool dissection per se, but the stuff's interesting. You'll get to see, you'll look at the sheep brain. I'll do a review at the end to get you in good shape for the quiz that's on Tuesday. And that's it. So that's basically the game plan today. Any general course questions that you guys can think
So
of?
it'll be Tuesday quiz and then Tuesday review for lecture on Thursday?
Correct. So I will do the in-class review on Tuesday for lecture exam 3, which is then on Thursday.
Okay.
Yeah. And I did post that kind of old video, but it's up there. It will help you. I also posted, right? I think I posted a thing for the final exam also. Yeah. Yeah. So you can watch that to your heart's content.
Do we have a breakdown of the exam on Thursday or no?
Do we have a breakdown of the exam on Thursday? Let me get back to it. I think I do. I think the short answer is yeah. Well, hold on a second. Hold on. Give me a second. Got to get into my classified Google Drive. Hold on.
I feel like it's going to be about equal with these chapters.
No, that's not it.
Did we get to the cerebellum last class? Did we get to the cerebellum last class?
All right.
Yeah.
That did
What
take
did
as
we
long
end
as I
on?
thought. I don't know what I was saying.
Oh, diacerebellum.
Nice.
Yeah. Diacerebellum.
So here's the breakdown of the number of questions per chapter.
Thank you.
All right. There you go.
Oh, that's
Okay.
gonna be fun.
So that's the breakdown.
Oh, the worst one has the most.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Always.
No, I mean it's just it's
The rule.
whatever's the longest is going to have the most, pretty much. I basically count up the number of PowerPoint slides, and then I project that forward to make it out of 100, and that's kind of what this represents. So anyway, any other questions before I launch into the lecture? All right, so back into brain stuff. Here's the big picture again. What were the 4 areas of the brain? Midbrain.
Cerebellum.
Well, wait. No, that's not even right. I'm just sorry. It's been such a long day. That's not one of the big 4 areas.
Brainstem?
Brainstem, thank you.
Cerebellum.
Cerebellum, cerebrum, and diencephalon. All right. The midbrain's part of the brainstem, so it's not one of the big parts. Sorry. I'm in a mood to accept wrongness. I don't know. It's been long. I'm just accepting wrong things at this point. Cerebrospinal fluid, that's this clear fluid that's made inside your brain and then it circulates. How do you make CSF? Anyone remember?
Through the blood?
Yeah, you filter the blood. You basically filter out like the liquid part of the blood. That's how you make the CSF. It then circulates, and then ultimately what happens to the CSF? It gets returned back to the blood, right? To kind of maintain homeostasis.
So does it diffuse in a way? Does the blood diffuse down or?
What do you mean by diffuse? Like the materials diffuse out of the blood, if that's what you mean. Like they kind of cross from the blood through the wall of like the the ependymal cells, they're the guys that are making it, and then it gets into the cerebral spinal fluid.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's following like diffusion. That's right. Brainstem. What are the three parts that make up the brainstem? Pons,
Medulla oblongata.
medulla, and the midbrain. Those are the three things that make it up. Is the brainstem important or not important?
Important.
Yeah, it's the most important in terms of just keeping you alive. Why is it the most important?
Because of all the things it controls.
Yeah, because of all the things it controls, it has a lot of important what they call vital centers, like for controlling your heart, controlling your breathing, all that stuff is in the brainstem, so it's the most important. Reticular formation, a part of the reticular formation is known as the reticular activating system. What's that important for? Yeah, waking you up and then helping you to maintain consciousness throughout the day. It's an area that extends in all three parts of the brainstem, but it's a super important area. Cerebellum, where do you find the cerebellum on your brain?
Behind the brainstem.
Yeah, it's behind the brainstem. And what's the function of the cerebellum?
Motor coordination.
Motor coordination. I like to think of it as like a quality control center for your body movements, right? Making sure that your actual body movements match up with your planned body movements, right? It's also important for posture, balance, all that stuff. All right, and that's kind of where we left off. So today we're going to start with the diencephalon, and then we'll do the cerebrum. So at that point, we've basically covered the four parts. But then, because it's kind of a big topic, we're going to go and talk about a portion of the cerebrum called the cerebral cortex, which is a super important part of the cerebrum, super part of your brain in general. So we will discuss that at some detail. But then we'll stop after that and save the cranial nerves and all this other nonsense for next week. The cranial nerves, again, you're not going to be asked about the cranial nerves on the quiz on Tuesday. That's good news, trust me. But they will raise their ugly head on the lecture exam that you have next Thursday. You'll also need to know about them on your last lab practical. And then, of course, there'll be questions about them on the final exam, too. They're kind of a big deal. Now, even though the cranial nerves are listed in the lab guide, I'm not going to really do them in lab, per se. Like, I'm not going to go through the cranial nerves today in lab. But I will cover them in great detail next week in lecture. And that, make sure you know the cranial nerves really well, because it'll pay off for the lecture exam on Thursday. It'll pay off for your third lab practical, and then it'll pay off for the final exam. I'll go through all that junk next week. All right, so jumping ahead to the diencephalon, wherever it is. There it is. Okay. Anyone remember what the prefix di meant?
In between.
Yeah, in between or in the center of. It does not mean to.
Sorry.
Just remember that. So in between or in the center of, and that's because it's kind of in the center of your brain. It's in between those two big cerebral hemispheres. Like I said, surgically, it's probably one of the most difficult areas to operate on, just because it's so deep and hard to get to. Okay. There's three parts to the diencephalon. The thalamus is kind of the biggest part. It makes up 80% of the diencephalon. It's located sort of right in the middle. And then you have the hypothalamus. What does the prefix hypo mean?
Under.
Below. So not surprisingly, the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. And then lastly, you have the epithalamus. What does the prefix epi mean?
Above.
Yeah, to cover or on top of. So you can see this whole thing in red is kind of covering the thalamus. That's the epithalamus. So starting with the thalamus. Thalamus makes up about 80%, like I said. What's the main function of the thalamus? You can think of it as a relay station for incoming sensory signals that are on their way to the cerebral cortex. Okay? We're going to talk about the cerebral cortex in a little bit, but basically, for you to be aware of any sensation, for you to be consciously aware of a sensation, it has to reach the cerebral cortex. Okay? If you block a signal at any point before it reaches the cerebral cortex, it'll be like that sensation didn't even happen, as far as you're concerned, because you won't perceive it. Okay? However, most sensory signals that come in to your brain, they don't go straight to the cerebral cortex. Instead, they stop off first at the thalamus, synapse with a new set of neurons that then carry the signal up to the cerebral cortex. So that's why they call it a relay station. Now, the key thing to this sentence that's in blue up here are two little words. Almost all right? There is one sensation that we have that goes straight to the cerebral cortex without stopping at the thalamus. Anyone know what sensation that is?
Smell.
It's smell. Or anyone know the fancy name for smell? Olfaction or olfactory, right, okay? So smell, for whatever reason, doesn't stop off. It goes straight to the cerebral cortex. So that's the main thing for the thalamus. Some other stuff, thalamus helps with motor function by transmitting info from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei that we'll talk about to the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. So the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex is where all of your voluntary movements begin. When you think of a movement that you want to do, you're thinking of it in this primary motor area, and then the signal is going to go down and be sent to places like the cerebellum or the basal nuclei. So the thalamus helps in kind of making those connections. This thalamus also relays nerve signals between different areas of the cerebrum. And lastly, it plays a role in helping you to maintain consciousness. So again, when you hear consciousness, think reticular activating system. That's going to be in the brainstem. But there are other areas of the brain that assist with that, and one of those areas is the thalamus. So it's also helping out with consciousness. Hypothalamus, it's below the thalamus, right? There are lots of nuclei located in the hypothalamus. What's the definition of a nucleus in the collection of neuron cell bodies in the CNS, right, in the central nervous system. What's it called if you have the same thing in the peripheral nervous system? I think you were about to say it. What was it? Starts with a G. Ganglia or ganglion, right? That's a collection.
I kept saying gang.
That's a collection of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, right? So anyway, you're going to have lots of neuron cell bodies kind of sitting, hanging out in the hypothalamus, and those cell bodies, they act as kind of control centers for some important activities that help you regulate homeostasis. So I think, a good maybe memory trick, hypothalamus starts with an H, so does the word homeostasis. So, the hypothalamus plays a big role in helping you to maintain homeostasis of all those different body parameters. One other fun fact about the hypothalamus is it's one of those examples of an organ or a tissue that's actually within two organ systems, right? It's got neurons, so it's in the nervous system, but it also produces hormones, so you could put it in the endocrine system. And in fact, you'll learn more about the endocrine part of the hypothalamus in A&P2, okay? The first chapter that's covered in A&P2 is chapter 18, and that's all about the endocrine system, and there's a lot of talk about the hypothalamus. You've probably heard of the pituitary gland before. Everyone heard of the pituitary? For a long time, the pituitary was thought to be kind of the master gland that controlled all the other glands in the body. So it was called like the master gland until about, I don't know my history exactly, but I want to say at least 30 or 40 years ago, somebody did more research on this and figured out that the pituitary is just taking orders from the hypothalamus. So the title of master gland or most powerful gland or whatever you want to call it went to the hypothalamus because it controls the pituitary, which then in turn controls like all the other glands in the body, okay? Anyway, put that in the back of your mind. We'll get more into that in AP2. Some specific functions of the hypothalamus that, include like the homeostasis aspect, regulating emotional and behavioral patterns. There's parts of the hypothalamus that make up what's called the limbic system. That's like the emotional part of your brain. Happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, whatever, all that stuff. Regulation of eating and drinking behaviors. So obviously that's super important, controlling your intake of nutrients and controlling your water intake and things like that. There's actually a feeding center in the hypothalamus. And if you stimulate that feeding center, what do you suppose happens?
Get hungry.
you become hungry and you try to seek out food, right? Conversely, there's also a satiety center. What do you suppose happens if you stimulate that?
You hungry?
Well, you don't get hungry. You get hungry if you stimulate the feeding center. If you stimulate the satiety center, you feel full. You don't feel hungry, right? You feel like you don't need to eat. There's also a thirst center that when it's stimulated, you'll try to seek out like water and things. Okay. So those are all parts of it. There's been a lot of interest in these centers. When I was in college, I worked with this crazy psychologist lady that was really into doing experiments on rats, and she had me and some of her other like loser students go, and we did these operations on these rats where we'd have to drill into their skull. We'd knock out first with anesthetic, right? But then we had to drill into their skull, and we had to put these little electrodes down into their brains using like, you have like this little device where you kind of lock their skull in, and then you can do measurements, and so you kind of know like how deep and where exactly to position the electrode. And during these experiments, we basically put the electrode in, and then we destroyed the satiety center. That was one of the things we did a lot of crazy shit to these like poor rats, but that was one of the things that we did. And the reason why we were doing that is that this psychologist, this professor that I was working with, she was really interested in eating disorders like anorexia, bulimia, things like that. And at the time, there was a thought that, you know, maybe individuals that have eating disorders have some problems with some of these centers that are in the hypothalamus. Anyway, we did this to these poor rats. Any guess what happens to rats if you knock out their satiety center? Like if that doesn't work anymore?
They eat themselves to death.
They get huge. They just keep eating, okay? Yeah, they don't have any controls at all. They just will keep eating. Like, so, you know, we're not she was not, I don't even know why we had to, this was fairly well proven at the time. I don't know if she just wanted to be mean to rats or whatever, but anyway, a lot of people have shown this, that if you knock that out, the rats will just kind of keep eating like crazy. Control the body temperature. The set point, what's the normal temperature in Fahrenheit? 98.6. What is it in Celsius? Oh, just like threw you a curveball. 37 degrees Celsius. 37 degrees Celsius is the normal body temperature. So that set point, whether you're talking Fahrenheit or Celsius, that's in the hypothalamus. That's where that set point is. So remember from chapter 1, you're going to have negative feedback systems that basically have temperature receptors out in your body. They send that into the hypothalamus using sensory neurons. This is the control center, if you will, or the integrating center, whatever you want to call it. It analyzes whatever your current body temperature is, and it compares that with the ideal body temperature. And if the two match up, nothing needs to be done. But if they don't match up, then the hypothalamus will send signals out using a motor neuron to some kind of an effector that tries to fix or correct the problem, right? You know, by making you like either, you know, if you're cold, right, it'll make you like shiver and try to generate heat that way. If you're overheating, it'll send signals to like sweat glands and make you sweat, right? Regulation of circadian rhythms, you know, like playing a role in controlling like your sleep and your wake cycles. And then states of consciousness, again, you know, there's a lot of brain parts that are kind of involved in the consciousness process. It all starts with that reticular activating system, but then you get things like the hypothalamus and the thalamus involved as well. Bless you. And then the last part is the epithalamus. The epithalamus is kind of interesting. It's got two parts to it. The pineal gland is a little tiny gland that makes melatonin. And where can you get melatonin? Yeah, you can go to like CVS or whatever and buy melatonin. And what does it do? It's supposed to make you feel sleepy, right? And fall asleep. You know, we naturally make it in the pineal gland, and the way it works is the nerves from our eyes are connected up to this pineal gland. And when it's light out and our eyes are being stimulated with light, that sends an inhibitory signal to the pineal gland and tells it not to release melatonin. But then as it starts to become dark out, that removes that inhibition, and suddenly the pineal gland will start churning out more melatonin, and hopefully that'll make you feel like sleepy at that point. Okay, I forget the exact hour. I want to say it's something like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. when melatonin levels are usually the highest in a person. It's something like that. And then as it goes closer to dawn, then that, as light comes out, the inhibition goes back, and then the pineal gland stops putting out the melatonin, and melatonin levels fall. Okay? There's also something in the hypothalamus called the habenular nuclei. They play a role in connecting odors with emotional responses. For whatever reason, we have like a really strong emotional connection to odors, like, oh, that's nasty, or oh, that smells good. Like for some reason we're like, I don't know, really tune in, maybe like an evolutionary thing, like, if we smelled like, death, we would like, oh crap, there's a T-Rex around here, I better run, or, oh, that smells good. There's another tribe that's like cooking something good, I'm gonna go over there. I don't know, I'm sort of speculating, I'm kind of spitballing here, but something like that. Now, this view that you see here, this is a view of the brainstem with the cerebellum removed. So the cerebellum would be right here. If you remove that and you look at the back of the brainstem, particularly the back of the midbrain, which is up here, the back of the midbrain, I mentioned on Tuesday, has these 4 bumps called the corpora quadrigemina. If you look above the 4 bumps, right in the midline, you should see the pineal gland. And then sort of above that, you'll see the habenular nucleus. And I'll show you in lab today on the sheep brain and then also on the plastic model how you can kind of look for those 4 bumps. And you might even be able to see the pineal gland too. Now, one other thing to mention before I leave the area of the diencephalon is something called the circumventricular organs. These are not separate structures. They're parts of the diencephalon. So part of the hypothalamus, part of the pineal gland, even part of the pituitary gland, they make up these circumventricular organs. Okay. By the way, I should also mention, the pituitary, it's not shown on this diagram, unfortunately, but the pituitary is basically hanging right off of the hypothalamus. There's a little stalk that connects it. If you look on this picture here, you can see on this model they actually left it in place. There's the little pituitary, and it hangs off of that hypothalamus area. Okay. Anyway, so parts of the hypothalamus, parts of the pineal gland, even parts of the pituitary, they make up the circumventricular organs. The circumventricular organs are special, or their claim to fame is that the capillaries that are there don't have a blood-brain barrier, which sounds like it kind of sucks because it represents kind of a vulnerability where things that are harmful in your blood could potentially cross and get into your brain tissue. And there's actually evidence, for example, like in people that have advanced HIV or actually have AIDS, sometimes they get HIV encephalitis, and there's evidence in those cases that the HIV actually got into the brain tissue by crossing at these circumventricular organs, taking advantage of the fact that there's no blood-brain barrier there. Unfortunately, these guys can't do their job if there's a blood-brain barrier. These guys in these circumventricular organs, they need to monitor your blood pressure. They need to monitor like the different solutes that are in your blood, and that can play a role in regulating your hunger and your thirst. If there's a blood-brain barrier in the way, it impairs their ability to monitor those things. So that's why there is no blood-brain barrier. They can't do their job with it there. All right, that's all I want to say about the diencephalon. So that's the third part, and now we're going to go into the last part, the fourth part. Any questions about the diencephalon? I'm pretty good with that. Okay, lastly, the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is kind of a big deal, okay? The cerebrum is our greatest, best part of our brain. It's what we're really good at. There's no other animals that have as big a cerebrum relative to the rest of their brain than we do, with the exception of maybe dolphins or, chimpanzees or, think of some smart animals, right? But certainly not like stupid dogs and cats, right? They don't have a big cerebrum. And most animals don't. But ours is really big, and that's because this is the area where we do all our complex thinking. All the analysis, the plotting, all the stuff that we did, the conniving, as well as like, good things and feeling, love and all this, all this other jazz. It's where you store your memories. All of that stuff is within the cerebrum somewhere. So it's a particularly important area of our brain. However, just remember, it's not the most important part of your brain in terms of just keeping you alive. Okay, that goes to the brainstem. And there's been cases, not to get too morbid here, but there are cases of people, trying to commit suicide or whatever, and knocking out parts of their cerebrum, with a gunshot wound or whatever, and they're still alive afterwards. So it just illustrates the fact that in terms of keeping you alive, it's not the most important part of your brain. Now, if you look at the cerebrum from the outside, there's going to be a really thin layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. And this part, why is gray?
No myelin.
Yeah, because there's no myelin. So in the gray matter, in the cerebral cortex, you're going to find parts of neurons that don't have myelin. So you'll find dendrites, cell bodies, and then maybe you'll find some just axons that are naturally unmyelinated. That's the kind of stuff that's going to be present in the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is super important, and that's why after I do a kind of a general intro to the cerebrum, that's why the last topic today is just going to focus on the cerebral cortex, because it's so important, okay? But the cerebral cortex is really actually thin. It's only about 2 to 4 millimeters thick. When you go below that, most of the inside of the cerebrum is going to be white matter. And what makes white?
Myelin.
It's going to be myelinated axons that are running in all kinds of different directions, and we'll talk about that in a second. Some of the axons are going up or going down. Some are going from the front of your brain to the back, or from the back to the front, and then some are crossing from the left to the right or the right to the left. But that's what you find in the white matter, lots of myelinated axons traveling in different directions. If you keep going into the cerebrum and go really deep, then eventually you do encounter some more gray matter, and they call that the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei help with body movements, kind of like the cerebellum helps with body movements. The basal nuclei also help with body movements, and we'll discuss that when we get there. So let's talk about the cortex first. It's only 2 to 4 millimeters thick. You can see it on the diagram over here. That's the cerebral cortex. When you look at the brain and the cerebrum, you notice all these big wormy things immediately, right? Every time somebody else, even a cartoonist, draws a brain, they always draw these big wormy things. The reason why you have those big wormy things is because the gray matter grows faster than the underlying white matter, and it sort of causes the cortex to fold on itself and create these big wormy things. Now, they don't call these things wormy things. They call them gyri, or that's the plural form, so like 2 or more gyri. The singular form is gyrus, okay? 1 gyrus. And in between the gyri, you find different grooves, and as you already know in A&P, they don't like to use the word groove. So once again, they use that same rule that we had with the spinal cord. If it's a deep, kind of wide groove, they'll call it a fissure. If it's a more shallow groove, they'll call it sulcus, or sulci is the plural form. Okay. So that's what's going on there. Now, the biggest fissure that you have is the one that runs right in the mid-sagittal plane that divides the right and left hemispheres. All right. So in other words, this guy that's going right down the middle, that's called the longitudinal fissure. That's the biggest fissure, and it divides the cerebrum into the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. Notice that fissure, though, it doesn't completely chop the brain in two. It just kind of separates the cerebrum from itself, but eventually, like this is a coronal section, right, or a frontal section. You can see that this would be the longitudinal fissure. It goes fairly deep, but eventually it stops, and the two hemispheres are connected in this whole area down here. Especially this spot here, the corpus callosum. This is a really important spot where axons can cross from the right to the left or from the left to the right, okay? This is yet another example of places where neurons can cross sides in your nervous system, right? We already talked about in the spinal cord. Remember, you had like the anterior white commissure and the gray commissure. Those were a place where you could cross sides. In the brainstem, we talked about the medulla with the decussation of the pyramids. That was a place to cross sides. So lots of opportunities for neurons to switch from right to left or left to right. Now, when you look at the cerebrum from the outside, they like to organize it into lobes, and the names of the lobes are based on the names of the bones that are kind of lying over top of that particular lobe, okay? And so, you know, underneath your frontal bone, you've got a frontal lobe. Roughly underneath your parietal bone, you got a parietal lobe. Underneath your temporal bone, you got a temporal lobe, and then underneath your occipital lobe, underneath your occipital bone, you got an occipital lobe, okay? Those are the four main lobes, and we're gonna talk a lot about those four main lobes, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. There is a fifth lobe, but it doesn't get as much attention, and they don't really know as much about it as the other lobes. Furthermore, you can't really see it from the outside. But if you could put your fingers into kind of this groove here. So here's the temporal lobe, and then the temporal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe by this groove here called the lateral cerebral sulcus. So if you could kind of put your fingers into that lateral cerebral sulcus and kind of retract the other lobes, then you could see this insula that's sort of sitting there, okay? But again, not as much is known about it. You're not gonna be responsible for finding the insula like on the lab, okay? Just be aware that it does exist for like lecture exam purposes. Now, I mentioned the longitudinal fissure is kind of the biggest, most obvious fissure. The most famous sulcus that you have on the brain is something called the central sulcus, and it kind of runs in the frontal plane. So it's kind of going across like this. And the central sulcus is a really important landmark because it represents the divider between the frontal lobe, which is anterior to it, and then the parietal lobe, which is posterior to it. Another key thing about the central sulcus are the two gyri that are on either side of it. The gyrus that's in front of the central sulcus up here, that's called the precentral gyrus. That's part of your frontal lobe, and that's where the primary motor area of your cortex is located. In other words, the primary motor area is the place where all of your ideas for voluntary movements start. So when you think you want to, text your friend, roll your eyes, walk across the room, whatever you're doing, all of those things are starting in this precentral gyrus in what they call the primary motor area. From there, the signal will go down, it'll stop at other different brain areas like the cerebellum or the basal nuclei, and then eventually it'll go down to your spinal cord and then out to the muscles that'll make you do the actual movement. Okay. Likewise, behind the central sulcus is also a famous gyrus, and that's called the postcentral gyrus. And that's famous because that's where the primary somatosensory area is located. This is the area where body sensations, skin sensations, have to go to in order for you to be consciously aware of them. So when you touch something, or you feel heat, or you feel pain, or whatever you feel on your skin, all those sensations that are carried by like Meissner's and Pacinian corpuscles and all that stuff you learned about, you become consciously aware of them when the signal eventually reaches that primary somatosensory area that's in the postcentral gyrus. Okay? Any questions about like those four lobes or anything? We're going to come back to them in a moment when we specifically talk about the cerebral cortex. But for now, we're going to go on and we're going to talk about the white matter. The white matter, again, represents myelinated axons, and they're basically running in three different directions. Again, what's the name? What's the name for the word? What's the word that means a bundle of axons in the central nervous system? What's a bundle of axons in the central nervous system? I'll give you a hint. It's to the left of me. Don't look.
Tracks.
Tract. All right. A tract is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. So, in this example, there. And anyone? Okay. Now, since we talked about that, what's the name for a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system?
Ganglia, no?
No, that's cell bodies. I'm telling you, you got to go back and look at that one slide on chapter 12. Anyway, it's called a nerve. When you have a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, it's called a nerve. When you have a bundle of axons in the central nervous system, it's called a tract. All right? Anyway, the tracts run in 3 different kinds of directions. There's association tracts, commissural tracts, and projection tracts. And this diagram, these 2 diagrams on the side here, they kind of show you the directions they're running. So with association tracts, you're connecting different gyri within the same hemisphere. So for example, maybe you have a gyrus that's up here on the right side that you want to connect with a gyrus that's back here on the right side. You could use an association tract to connect those 2, okay? The point is, you're staying within the same hemisphere. You're not crossing sides with an association tract. So in this picture down here, this would be like some examples of association tracts that are just running and connecting different gyri within the same hemisphere. If you cross sides, then you're called a commissural tract. Okay? And that's again why they use those words with the spinal cord, the anterior white commissure and the gray commissure. So if you hear the word commissure or commissural tract, it usually means something's crossing sides. And the most famous commissural tract, which essentially we already talked about, is that corpus callosum. Okay? That it's shown there, but let me just refresh your memory. So on this diagram here, that's the corpus callosum, and that's an example of a commissural tract. That's filled up with axons that are either crossing to the left or crossing to the right. Okay, it's not labeled. Is it labeled? Yeah, it's not, you can't see it real well, but on this diagram, that would be the corpus callosum there, and you can see the little red axons that are crossing sides there. And then the third type of tract we already talked about, but we didn't really use this name for it. We didn't call them projection tracts, but projection tracts are just tracts that either go up or go down. And when we talked about the spinal cord, we were essentially talking about projection tracts. When you have a tract that goes up, what kind of signals is it carrying? Sensory. And when it goes down, it's carrying motor, right? So projection tracts would be like on this diagram, these things here. Either they're going up or they're coming down. And they may cross sides like they are, you can see they're crossing sides there, but they're going up and they're going down. Now, eventually, if you go deep enough, you do see more gray matter in the cerebrum, and that's called the basal nuclei. And there's 3 basal nuclei, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. I think when you hear basal nuclei, you should think of, helping to regulate your body movements, okay? Body movement is very complicated. It starts in the primary motor area of your cerebral cortex. We'll talk about that in a second. But then it goes down and it gets sent to places like the cerebellum, and it gets sent to places like the basal nuclei, and then eventually it gets sent down to your muscles. But, it's very complicated, and the basal nuclei are playing a role in that. What do? They can help you start and stop movements, so initiating and terminating movements. They can suppress unwanted movements, and then they can regulate muscle tone, okay? Like setting kind of like, even when you're not using your muscles, remember there's a little bit of contraction going on in your muscles at all times just to give them sort of the optimal starting length if you do decide to use that muscle, to give, the right amount of overlap between the thick and thin filaments, and, helping to set that muscle tone. The basal nuclei play a role in that. Some diseases that are thought to involve the basal nuclei: Parkinson's disease, OCD, schizophrenia, chronic anxiety. They're all thought to somehow involve the basal nuclei. Basal nuclei also controls those subconscious contractions of skeletal muscle, like when you walk, naturally swinging your arms, right? A good example of like the important role of the basal nuclei is if you have a person with Parkinson's disease, and you'll see some of these things going on here. You'll notice what happens when the basal nuclei isn't working properly. For example, I mentioned this, I think, in the last class. A person with Parkinson's often walks like this without swinging their arms. Okay? They're bent forward sometimes. Their posture is affected. When they try to walk, they have a hard time getting started. They can't initiate their movement. So sometimes it's almost like they have to fall into it, like they got to sort of fall forward and then start walking. And then to stop themselves, it's hard to stop themselves sometimes, and they may fall over, or they have to hold on to something. Also, they get like a characteristic sort of tremor, and that's because they can't suppress an unwanted movement. Okay, so all of those features you can see with it. The limbic system is something. I should have asked you guys this already. Have anybody in here taken a psychology class or whatever? There's a lot of overlap in this chapter, or there's little details that you probably heard of. Did you guys hear about the limbic system in a psych class or something? It's considered to be the emotional part of your brain. So, you know, happiness, sadness, anxiety, fear, anger, whatever the emotion is you're talking about, it's supposed to arise in the limbic system. The limbic system is not one anatomic structure that you can point at. Okay, you can't take these plastic models in lab and point at the limbic system. Okay, and that's why it's not listed in your lab guide. We're not going to make you find the limbic system. The limbic system is more of a functional system that's made up of parts of different brain areas. So if you were to try to like show the limbic system, you'd actually have to kind of color in parts of some of the other brain areas, and it would look, it's very complicated. It would look something like this if you colored in all the parts of the limbic system. So, you know, parts of the cerebrum, parts of the diencephalon, parts of, you know, all these other areas, they make up the limbic system, but you can't just point to it real clearly and separate it out, okay? Together with parts of the cerebrum, the limbic system functions in memory. You may have realized this, or maybe not, that you have stronger, longer lasting memories if there's some emotion attached to them, right? If I just tell you to memorize a random 7-digit number that you don't have any connection with, you'll probably forget it pretty quickly. If I happen to tell you to memorize or remember a number and it then turns out to be, I don't know, a number of a boyfriend the phone number of a boyfriend that dumped you, right? Then you're like, oh yeah, I remember that number, and you'll remember it for a long time because you had an emotional tie to it in some way, okay? So if you can connect emotions with memories, then you'll remember it longer. So my advice when you're studying A&P is to get emotional. You know, really cry it out when you're studying this stuff. You'll remember it longer. All right, last section that I'm going to talk about today, I'm actually making pretty good time, but this is a big topic too, is I'm going to delve more into the cerebral cortex now because it's a big deal and there's lots to say about it. Any questions about just the cerebrum in general before I focus on the cerebral cortex? All right, so again, the cerebral cortex is the gray matter that's on the outside. It's only about 2 to 4 millimeters thick, but it's still super important. There's billions of neurons there, and they like to divide the cerebral cortex into 3 types of functional areas. Either your sensory area, a motor area, or an association area. Okay? Sensory areas are the areas that your body sensations have to reach for you to become consciously aware of it. Okay? So in the cerebral cortex, there's an area for, you know, like I said, skin sensations. And the signal, you know, has to reach that point in the cerebral cortex for you to be like, oh, something just touched me on the arm, okay? There's a sensory area for vision that images have to reach for you to be able to say, oh, I see something, okay? So those are sensory areas. The sensory areas are specifically located in the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. So what's the only lobe that they're not located in? Frontal. Okay, sensory are not located in the frontal lobe, they're only located in those other 3. On the other hand, motor areas are only located in the frontal lobe. Okay, motor areas are in charge of doing your voluntary motor movements. Okay, so, you know, walking across the room, waving at your friend, whatever it is starting someplace in a motor area in the frontal lobe. And then the third type are the association areas. Association areas are the kind of areas that give meaning to the sensory areas, okay? The sensory areas themselves make you aware of something, but they don't attach meaning to it. That comes after a sensory area communicates with an association area. And association areas develop with time and learning and experience and things. And so, you know, for example, you take like a newborn and, never use this example. You take a newborn and you whip a baseball at the newborn, all right? It hits the newborn. The newborn's gonna be like, ah, it's gonna cry, right? And that's gonna come because when that ball hits them, or her, it's going to go up to one of these primary sensory areas, and that's going to make the baby aware of that sensation. But that baby's never experienced a baseball before, so that's kind of where it's going to stop. The baby will cry, and that kind of stops. Now, if you do that to, like, you know, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, maybe some kid who's played baseball or whatever, the signal will first go there, like it did in the newborn, and it'll be like, ow! And then the signal will be sent over there, like, damn it, that was a baseball. You know, like, you know, it'll be sent from that area to where the association area was, where you learned what a baseball was like and all that kind of thing. Okay? Don't throw any baseballs at newborns, all right? I was just, you know, it's just a little silly example. Notice that these association areas are also the same places where the sensory areas are. They usually sit right next door. So you'll have like a primary sensory area for like sensations on the skin, and then right next to it will be an association area for skin sensations. Okay? And I'll show you that. I got a little map here, and here's the little map. So if you can, we'll do this in lab, but you will be asked to basically be able to put all these numbers on a brain. All right, I'm kidding. You don't have to put them. I just want to see people freak out. That's what I mean about an emotional attachment to the information. I just want to see.
That was it. That was it.
No, you can ignore these numbers. These were put down by some loser in 1909.
He's a loser.
Named Brodmann. You totally don't need to know the numbers. But you do need to know kind of the colored areas, and I'll keep coming back to this picture and kind of show you this stuff. These are areas that you won't have to identify these in lab either, but you should kind of know where they are for like the next lecture exam, for example. Okay, so I'll come back to this picture a couple of times, but let me just give you your bearings first on this picture. So first of all, here's the central sulcus coming down here. So everything from here over, this is all frontal lobe. Everything right behind it would be parietal lobe. Here is the lateral cerebral sulcus, so this is all going to be temporal lobe. And then this back here is going to be the occipital lobe. So let's talk about the sensory areas first. Again, when you hear sensory, you should immediately think parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. And the first sensory area to talk about, which I already mentioned a few slides back, is something called the primary somatosensory area. What does the prefix soma mean, or somato? What's soma mean? It means body. So this is the primary body sensory area. What does that mean? Basically skin sensations. Skin sensations, touch, pain, hot, cold, tickle, itch, all of those skin sensations, for you to be consciously aware of them, they have to reach this primary somatosensory area. Where is it? Well, I mentioned this before, but it's in the postcentral gyrus. So, in other words, it's in that gyrus that sits right behind the central sulcus. So here's the central sulcus, and then this thing that they highlighted in blue would be the primary somatosensory area. It's in the post-central gyrus. Post, what does prefix post mean? It means like kind of behind or back, right? So this is behind or back of the central gyrus. Central sulcus. Notice that it is part of the parietal lobe, right? Which makes sense because the parietal lobe is sensory. And when they discovered this area, so, you know, when something touches your skin, it's going to have to eventually reach that area for you to be like, oh, something just touched my skin. When they did further research on this area, they realized you could actually map the body out where different skin sensations go on that primary somatosensory area. And when they did that and mapped it out, they created this kind of funny looking little person over here that they call the sensory homunculus. Okay? Do the body parts that you see on that picture, do they match up with the actual size of those body parts?
No.
No. Then what is the size based on then if it's not based on the actual physical size?
Sensory
It's
fit.
based on how sensitive that body part is. Okay? The more sensitive a body part is, the more brain space it gets. So, you know, your fingers, your hand, it's very sensitive. That's why it's so huge on your brain. Your lips, your tongue, it's very sensitive, so that's why there's a big part of it. Conversely, your back is like a physically big part of your body, but it's really not that sensitive, so that's why there's not much back space on the brain. Okay? So that's the primary somatosensory area. That's where skin type sensations have to go to. But there's also going to be primary sensory areas for all of your other senses. So there's a primary visual area that visual stimuli have to go to for you to be consciously aware of it. There's a primary auditory area where sounds have to go to for you to be consciously aware of them. Primary gustatory area, primary olfactory area. But by the way, what does gustation mean?
Taste.
That's taste. And what does olfaction mean?
Smell.
Smell. So just to go back to that picture to show you where those areas are. There's the primary somatosensory area, so think skin. Back here in the occipital lobe is the primary visual area, okay? So that's where images have to go when you see things to be consciously aware of them. Have you ever been, anyone here ever been sort of hit in the back of the head? What happens when you get hit in the back of the head? You see stars. That's because you're directly stimulating that area, and when you stimulate that, it creates kind of this visual effect of seeing stars. Yeah. Notice there's a primary auditory area that's located like in the temporal lobe over there. Okay. Primary gustatory area you can see there. So again, every sensation is going to have its own special spot that it has to reach for you to be consciously aware of that sensation. All right, now let's talk, so that was sensory. Let's talk about motor now. And now you should think about frontal lobe when you hear motor. And again, the area where you originate your voluntary motor activities is just in front of the central sulcus in something called the precentral gyrus, and they name this area the primary motor area. So this is in the frontal lobe, just in front of the central sulcus. Again, if you need a visual, go back to this picture, and basically it's this area that's highlighted in red, okay? That's the primary motor area, and it's in the precentral gyrus. So, once again, if you want, you could draw out your body on the primary motor area, similar to what you did for the primary somatosensory area, and create this kind of weird looking guy. Now, because this is now motor, you'd call it the motor homunculus and not the sensory homunculus. But once again, does the size of the body parts on your brain match up with their actual physical size?
No.
No. Instead, in this case, what's it based on?
Fine.
It's based on how much control you have over that body part. Body parts that you have a lot of fine control over, like your fingers, or like your tongue with speaking, or things like that, or even like your eyes, they're going to have a relatively big area because there's going to be a lot of neurons going to that body part to help you control it. Versus, again, I hate to be picking on the back, but all right, the back kind of sucks. The back, you don't have a lot of fine, you got your huge latissimus dorsi and your trapezius muscles, but you don't have a lot of fine control over those muscles, so there's not as many neurons that are going to it, and so that's why it's represented that way. Now, speaking of motor areas, there's kind of a famous motor area that you should be aware of. That again, in the frontal lobe, it sits kind of close to that lateral cerebral sulcus, and it's called Broca's area. And if you've taken a psych class or something, you may have heard of this area. Broca's area, they sometimes call it just Broca's area, or they, if you want, you can call it Broca's speech area to kind of remind you what it does. Specifically, it's involved in controlling the muscles that allow you to speak. So helping to control your lips, helping to control your tongue, helping to control the muscles that go to your vocal cords, all that stuff, okay? In most people, it's on the left hemisphere only. 97% of people have Broca's area in their left hemisphere only. The other 3% either have it in the right hemisphere or they have some bilaterality where it's a little bit on both sides, okay? So if you go back to my favorite dumb drawing, first of all, just notice that this is someone's right cerebral hemisphere, but the area, you can still imagine it. This is where Broca's speech area would be. It's in the frontal lobe, kind of sits close to that lateral cerebral sulcus. That would be the area. The only thing, again, that I have to emphasize is that in most people, Broca's is on the left side, even though they're showing it on the right here. Yeah.
I know we don't have to worry about the numbers, but
Yeah.
why is there a 44 and 45 for Broca's?
That's a good question. I imagine that maybe this Brodmann loser, he like figured out some difference in something between 44 and 45. Exactly what, I don't know. I'm getting so angry talking about him. Just don't bring him up again, Jess. It's infuriating. It's making my blood boil. All right. I really should look this guy. He's probably like a really nice guy. I probably should look him up.
Chris, you would be grave now for talking all this junk about
I,
him.
I don't, well, wait. How do you know he's dead? Maybe he's still around.
19.
He could be the oldest man alive. I don't know. That'd be great if like the ghost of this guy walked in the room now and sat down and started throwing stuff at me. Anyway, now one thing that's important about Broca's area is if you have damage to Broca's area, it can affect your ability to speak. Okay, and that's known as when you have problems communicating, they call that aphasia. So aphasia is a general word that means like problems with communication. When you specifically have damage to like Broca's area, they call that a Broca's aphasia, or it's also known as a non-fluent aphasia. And so, what does that mean? Well, you got somebody, say, that has a stroke, and maybe they destroyed or they damaged Broca's area, and they have this problem, and you ask them a question, like, hey, Mrs. Smith, how are you today? She'd be like, you would not be able to understand the words. They wouldn't be intelligible, all right? And that's because she can't send signals properly to the muscles that are moving her lips, her tongue, her vocal cords. And it's probably pretty frustrating for her because she has clear thoughts, she understands what you're asking, she knows what she's trying to say, but she can't say it because she can't control those muscles effectively. Okay? By the way, this is another reason why if the stroke fairy shows up at your door tonight, well, first of all, don't let him in. Don't answer the door. But if you have to answer the door and the stroke fairy says, I gotcha, here's the bad news. You got to have a stroke. But the good news is I'll let you pick which side you have the stroke on. Which side should you choose?
Right side.
Choose the right side. Play the odds. If you have a stroke on the right side, you'll probably still be able to talk and communicate. If you have it on the left, just depending on how big the stroke is, you might not be able to speak, right? All right. Let me talk last about the association areas. So association areas, they do a variety of things, including giving meaning to the incoming sensations. So for every primary sensory area, there's going to be a corresponding association area. So primary somatosensory area makes you conscious of skin sensations. Somatosensory association area tells you through experience and memories exactly what that sensation is, so you can identify it, right? Now, you step on a nail. If you've never encountered a nail before, you'll probably just scream. But if you've seen nails before, you know what a nail looks like. Maybe you've even done this before. You're like, damn it, I just stepped on a nail. You'll know it, right? Same thing with visual, same thing with auditory. And these areas are usually located very close to where the primary area is. So back to the crazy picture again. Notice here's the primary somatosensory area in blue. That makes you aware of someone, say, touching you on the skin. But then right next door to it is the somatosensory association area. So first the signal would come in here. You'd be like, oh, something touched me. And then boom, it would move over to here very quickly and be like, oh, that was, someone's hand, or that was, whatever that touched me, all right? Same thing with all the other ones too. So primary visual area is right there, makes you consciously aware of some image, but then surrounding the primary visual area is the visual association area, and it gives meaning to it. Same thing with sound. Primary auditory area is there, and then sitting really close to it is the auditory association area. Another association area is the facial recognition area. This is an area of our brain that's devoted to just being able to identify faces. Like, faces are, they're simple in the sense that we got 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, 2 ears, all right, that's simple. But then being able to tell all the different faces apart is, challenging, but if you believe in evolution, it was probably pretty important. You want to oh wait, is that caveman part of my tribe? Like, are we friends, or he's gonna kick my ass? You want to know friend from foe. So there was a protective mechanism in becoming really good at identifying faces, right? Odor recognition, again, I mentioned the habenular nucleus that sort of attaches emotions to odors. We're pretty good at identifying different odors, okay, and that again might be a protective function. Now, Wernicke's area is another area that they usually say, or they usually talk about when they talk about Broca's area, because the two are related. But Wernicke's area is involved in understanding speech. When you're spoken to by someone else, understanding what they're saying, okay? So it's an association area. It's, again, usually on the left side. So it's usually on the same side that Broca's area is on, which, again, is another reason why if you can choose where to have a stroke, pick the right side, because you don't want to get this area affected either. So going back to my drawing, you can see back here is Wernicke's area. So there's Wernicke's area, there's Broca's area. If you knock out Wernicke's area, then you get what's called a Wernicke's aphasia. Also known as a fluent aphasia. So, these people, assuming you had like a stroke that only affected Wernicke's area, these people, they don't have any problems controlling like their lips, their tongue, their vocal cords. That's fine. But they don't understand the questions that people are asking of them. They don't even understand the meaning of their own words when they hear them coming back to themselves after they speak them. So, if you asked, Mrs. Smith, and she has Wernicke's aphasia, how you doing today, Mrs. Smith? She'd be like, baseball, satellite, day camp, baloney. It'd be like, where did that come from, right? Like, where did those words come from? That's known as word salad. Each individual word is understandable, but they don't make a sentence that makes any sense because the person doesn't have any understanding either of your question or of the words that they're like saying, okay?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can this happen with patients with dementia?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. It could be, I'm just using a stroke as an example, but there could be other causes, yeah, yep.
And you could also have a stroke that affects both areas?
Absolutely. I was just about to say that. Like, unfortunately, the stroke fairy isn't nice, and sometimes you could have a massive stroke that kind of affects that whole area, so you'd knock out both. Yeah, and that, that's obviously kind of the worst case scenario when that both happens. Okay. By the way, people that have these problems, you may know this or maybe you don't know this, they can get better and maybe learn to speak again. Okay. Is that because they're making new neurons? No. It's because the living neurons, the ones that didn't die with the stroke, they might be able to kind of work around the damaged area and make new synapses, new connections that compensate or sort of retrain the brain, if you will, in order to speak again. So, that's why there's a value to occupational therapy, physical therapy, all that stuff after a stroke. You don't just throw in the towel, you can't speak, tough luck, They actually can improve, but it's not because they're making new neurons, it's just they're sort of compensating with new connections.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So would it also, what if you understand multiple languages? Would you have a Wernicke that's working a little bit harder than somebody who doesn't speak multiple languages or something like that? Because it says interprets meaning of speech by recognizing spoken words. So
Yeah, that's a very good question. You mean is it more developed in somebody that's multilingual?
It's just being used more.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that is the short answer, but it makes sense. Yeah, you would think that would be more active because you're specifically honing in on all these different variations and different things. So yeah, it makes sense for sure. Some other association areas, the common integrative area. This is a place, kind of a meeting place for all of the sensations to kind of share their experience, if you will. All right, when you see, I don't know, your friend or your spouse or whatever, you're relying on as much as you can to make that identification, right? You're looking at them for the visual recognition. You're listening to the sound of their voice. If they wear a particular perfume or cologne or Axe body spray or whatever the hell they put on, right? You're smelling that. You're putting it all together when you make an identification. And that kind of ability to collaborate happens in this spot that they call the common integration area. And not surprisingly, it's kind of located right in the middle of everything. So right in that area where it can kind of get things from the skin, from the vision, from the auditory, it's kind of right in the center there. Now, the prefrontal cortex is a very interesting area. I know I said association areas are typically in the parietal, the temporal, and occipital, but these last three are actually in the frontal lobe, and they do some interesting things, especially the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is important for your analytical ability, thinking, solving, problem solving. It's important for how quick a learner you are, but it's probably best known for being the place that helps control your personality, or where your personality is located. And for those of you that took a psych class, or even if you didn't take a psych class, anyone in here ever hear of this guy named Phineas Gage? Yeah, it's so boring. All right, and what was that guy? What did he do?
He got a rod stuck through his brain, something like that.
Yeah, he got a rod stuck through his brain.
I remember that.
Yeah, and anyone remember what he was doing?
He was making a rail.
Yep, he was making a railroad. That's right. Yeah, so this was back in the 1800s, and I guess he was hitting a hammer, and I don't know if there was a stick of dynamite. Somehow an explosion happened. I don't know if there's a stack of dynamite right next, and he missed the hit and hit the dynamite or what. But the rail was shot up, and it went. I think it actually went through his cheek.
Face.
Yeah, through his whole face, up through his eye socket, and then the tip of that rail went in. They didn't know it at the time, but it went into this area called the prefrontal cortex. And then what happened?
He was
to him after?
He was totally fine. Other than his personality, he became really mean or something.
Yeah, he became a jerk afterward. I guess before the thing, he was the nicest
Super
guy
nice.
ever. Just give you the shirt off his bag. Have drinks with you. Whatever. But then he just became like a jerk. He wasn't responding to texts. He just became a total ass, and like everybody hated him after that.
He was like fine otherwise.
Maybe. I don't know, Jess. I don't know. Yeah, he did something. He switched sides. I don't know what happened, but he became a total jerk afterwards. I mean, first of all, you got to give the guy credit for getting incredibly lucky. This is the 1800s. They didn't have good neurosurgeons back then. You know, I don't know why he didn't get an infection. I mean, I don't know if he, again, just must have got lucky. There weren't good antibiotics back then or anything like that, but it's a miracle the guy even survived. And apparently afterwards, I think with this, as the story goes, he kind of leaned into his disability afterwards and kind of went on like a circus tour where like he would carry around the spike and show it to people and, you know, try to get money and stuff and talk about his experience and whatnot. I think that's what happened. Premotor area, this is another association area. This one helps to create plans for learned motor activities. If you've got some special work skill that you do that not everyone else has, or if you play like a musical instrument, you know, you know how to, like, when you're playing an instrument, you know how to hold your hands, you know the feel of what the keys or the strings or whatever instrument you're playing, you know how everything has to be. That kind of muscle memory and that stored precision type information is stored in like the premotor area, okay? And then finally, the frontal eye field area. This is an area that's devoted to just causing your eyes to be able to scan from left to right and right to left, back and forth, nice and smoothly. And that's believed to be an important area, again, through evolution, because like when you're out, you know, in the prehistoric times or whatever, you know, you're constantly like looking around for like T-Rex, like, you know, so you need your eyes to kind of, they get you like a swivel. All right. What am I doing here? I'm almost done. Where I need to be today. Am I almost done? I don't even know. I think I'm almost done. Hemispheric lateralization. This is just the concept that even though our brain looks more or less symmetrical, like if you look at a plastic model or whatever, the two hemispheres look about the same size, and that there are actual functional differences in most people from the left side to the right side. Okay? One example of hemispheric lateralization is already what we said about Broca's and Wernicke's area. You know, in most people, it's on the left side of the brain. It's not on the right side. So that's one example of hemispheric lateralization. But you know, some other ones I'll talk about in the next slide. One thing that they've noticed, for whatever reason, is there seems to be more lateralization in men than in women. In other words, men sort of put all their eggs in one basket. They're like, you know, all right, I'm going to devote the left side of my brain for this activity and only the left side, and the right side will instead do this activity and only this activity. Whereas women sort of spread it around and like, oh, okay, we'll do this activity a little bit on the left, but we'll have it on the right, which, you know, probably seems like a better way, because if you got, like, you know, destroyed one side or had a stroke somewhere, at least you still have the other side to, you know, do it. So yes, I'm giving a sort of roundabout compliment to women here. Yeah. You're welcome. You're welcome. Now, you probably heard this in a psych class, but the left hemisphere is considered to be like more tuned into sort of analytical skills, reasoning, you know, math type skills, ability to you know, learn you know, languages, for example. The right side, on the other hand, is generally considered to be the more creative side with musical and artistic awareness and stuff like that. That's generally true in most people. You may have also heard that if you're right-handed, like most people are, you're more likely to be left brain dominant. Actually, if you're left-handed, you're still more likely to be left brain dominant than you are to be right brain, but you have a higher likelihood, if you're left-handed, of being right hemisphere dominant compared to a person that's right-handed, if that makes any sense. So in other words, most of us are thought to be left brain dominant. Brain waves, these are electrical signals that you can pick up on someone's brain by putting little electrodes on their scalp. That procedure is known as an EEG. You know, neurons, when they're sending their graded potentials and their action potentials, they're not generating big signals. You know, it's measured in millivolts, which is a pretty small difference. So when you put these electrodes on, they're really only able to measure like the neurons that are in the cerebral cortex because that's the layer that's close to you, to the surface, right? But nonetheless, the electrodes are sensitive enough that they can actually see some activity there. EEGs, electroencephalograms, are useful for a number of reasons. They'll do them sometimes during sleep studies. They'll do them to diagnose, seizures. Try to find out, like, if a person has epilepsy. Sometimes you can find what's called an epileptic focus, like a particular area in the brain where the seizure is kind of starting. Obviously, it's also important in the case of a person that's like in a coma, and you want to see if there's any brain activity going on, so you do an EEG on them, and then that can sort of guide your decision making in terms of whether you continue with like the ventilator and sort of aggressive measures, or whether you start laying off on that stuff. Types of brain waves, 4 of them. Honestly, I'm so thankful that I never had to read these things, because some of these, they just kind of look, these first 2, I don't know, I can't really tell. One's blue, one's red. I really can't tell the difference between them. But anyway, alpha waves, they're 18 to 13 cycles per second. They are your most common waves when you're just kind of chillaxing like you are now. You're not doing any too heavy thinking, which I assume you're not doing right now. Or maybe you are, I don't know. That's an alpha wave, okay? When you really start to put your mind to something and really try to think and analyze or whatever, then it speeds up a bit and you get into what are called beta waves that run from 14 to 30 cycles per second. Theta waves, which are relatively slow, indicate emotional stress or a brain disorder. And then lastly, delta waves, which are the slowest, they are normal when you're sleeping or when you're in deep sleep. If you see them in a person that's supposed to be awake, they're not a good sign. They indicate that there's some kind of brain damage going on. I'm sure you would identify. I'm sure there'd be other symptoms besides the EEG probably. If somebody was brain damaged enough to actually have those kind of signs when they're awake, they're probably not like, going to be all that talkative, or they're probably not like winning any awards for like conversation. All right, that's where I'm stopping for today. Any questions about any of that stuff? Woo. So go ahead, take your break. When you come back, there are some classic brain models you can look at, and then there's also these cut sheep brains that you can take a peek at too. We had a shortage of sheep brains. There's only 2 sheep brains that are uncut. Does anybody want to actually cut the sheep brain?
Not if there's a shortage. We're not looking at it.
Well, no, we got 2. I can give 2. You can fight it out, or you don't have to do it. You want to try to do one? All right. So I got 1 taker, but anyway, you guys go ahead, take your break, decide what you want to do, then come back and we'll go through all this stuff.
Sheep brain doesn't smell like.
Yes, yeah, my peanut butter. I don't know about y'all, but I want to cut a brain. No? No brain cutting.
Because you cut it.
Yeah, I want to cut a brain.
take a break.
Tell me twice.
Why do you think I like that? Oh, you're freezing.
I'm cold.
Me?
Yeah.
I didn't know this was real.
I don't know. I don't feel like it. You touching it? I'm not. I'm saying. I know, you're like, oh. But I wasn't. Oh, so I have a okay.
Wait, Stanford or
Oh, it's really difficult.
well, I'm pushing. There, get there. No, but okay, I was gonna say in the past, he was, he sits around, and I say he's on, I forget what it is, they're saying, we're just the first time. I said, he draws and he takes it multiple times, so he has to fail, and so he takes it, it's a big part-time with help. So wait, do we need to take any forward international?
I think it's part of it.
No, it doesn't.
Because my certificate by December.
Okay.
And then you have college.
Okay. So then you should send me the number, right? Is that what you want?
Yeah, yeah. I think she said once or odd.
Okay,
And then it's the forward.
okay. So then after, I guess after this, you're allowed to apply?
Oh, you want to
Sorry?
It's a lot. Did you set up a micro?
I do, I'm not here, and, he's a time. I actually, had to drop him, he's still there, and I went with Stephanie. Because I wanted, I was with, I was involved in his class, and another, the only guy.
Yeah, there's only one.
There was one, there was one, no, like, yeah, I think I knew, so then I was like, oh god. And so the majority, it's whatever people go to his time, it's a lot easier. So then I was like, me too, and then I was like, then I got the stuff, there's still space in
Oh, yeah.
Sonic, but it's on Tuesday, who's Sonic, it's on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 12:30, and it's hybrid, so it's like,
Oh.
an hour there, and then I'm not, yeah. Yeah. HOUS is, S-A, Tonic, T-O-N-I-C.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's.
Go ahead, we can watch. Dang, you still not back? You're back?
Yeah.
Still not back? It's been like 10 minutes already.
Same time, but. But they said, I read the
Yeah, she's real.
okay.
I asked dumb questions.
Maybe we follow the same.
Yeah, really. They touch me. Exchange teaching.
Right.
No, what?
Yo, you know what's
Crazy. That DA smells like
I'm like, it's the delivery. It's the fucking delivery fee they hit you, and then I'm like, are you serious? Like, I forget how cold it is when we get back in here.
No, I just want to take a picture of this stuff.
parents, honestly. Let me get a real answer.
That was a really good apple.
You are funny. Oh my god.
Trader Joe's got the best apples ever.
Just go into business for apples. Like, actually be a farmer.
I would
actually not
love
a
to
bad
be a
job.
farmer.
I know. But
I
apparently
would
it's
love
like
to be a farmer.
crazy expensive to
I
be
got
a farmer.
land in Vermont, and I. Yeah,
You have land?
Yeah. I live in Vermont, bro.
That was around there. Not like a good way.
No, I have a coworker,
He smells like baby powder, and it's like the most comforting thing sometimes. Like when the chief gets pregnant, so near him, I'm just like, no.
I can see that.
I had a guy on my back
One,
for a
one,
while
two,
there.
three, and that's part of
I'm sitting here chopping away.
the.
And he's like,
Cerebellum.
yeah, why?
That's
Super
right
allergic.
there,
Like,
right?
go away.
What, I think they just smell like it.
He said that he could smell.
Yeah, sometimes it's airborne. That's why I was thinking when she said that, like, what takes forever?
That's so crazy.
You just
One of
breathe
the
on
students
someone.
delivers the peanut butter.
Let me know.
And he's like,
Technology. No, don't lie.
Sorry.
Don't lie.
I was gonna walk.
Oh. Yeah, I just.